Most people believe control begins when someone gives an order. In 2026, that belief is what keeps the strings invisible. No one told you that you entered a game. There was no announcement, no contract, no moment of consent. Yet every day, your decisions are shaped, narrowed, and gently redirected by systems that do not need your loyalty, only your participation. This is how a puppet exists in 2026, not restrained, not threatened, but guided by design. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you first have to understand a difficult truth. The game does not require obedience anymore. Obedience is inefficient. What it requires is predictability. And predictability is produced when people believe they are acting freely while responding to the same pressures, incentives, and feedback loops as everyone else. In earlier eras, power was visible. Authority had a face. Control was enforced through hierarchy, punishment, or force. But the modern game is quieter. In 2026, power structures learn that resistance fades when control feels optional. You are not pushed. You are nudged. You are not ordered. You are optimized. This is why so many intelligent, capable people still end up as puppets in someone else's game. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the game is designed to feel like self-expression. Your choices appear personal, but the range of acceptable choices has already been defined. The board is set before you ever make a move. Consider how often you feel behind. Behind in career, relevance, visibility, achievement, or stability. That feeling is not accidental. It is one of the most effective strings in the modern system. When urgency replaces reflection, reaction replaces choice. And when reaction becomes habitual, autonomy disappears without a fight. This is exactly how being a puppet in 2026 works. Not through domination, but through tempo. The game moves quickly, so you don't have time to question why you're moving at all. What makes this especially dangerous is that the game does not announce itself as manipulation. It presents itself as opportunity. Growth, progress, alignment. Participation becomes framed as ambition, and hesitation becomes framed as weakness. Opting out feels irresponsible. Slowing down feels like falling behind. And so, without coercion, people step exactly where the board expects them to. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must recognize that control no longer comes from telling people what to do. It comes from shaping what feels reasonable to want. When desires are engineered, behavior follows automatically. No strings need to be pulled. You pull them yourself. This is why so many people defend the very systems that exhaust them. The game rewards those who internalize its logic. You begin to measure yourself using its metrics. You judge your worth through its signals. You optimize for outcomes it defines. At that point, the puppet no longer needs a puppeteer. The role has been fully internalized. And here is the most unsettling part. The game does not care whether you win or lose, only that you keep playing. Advancement and burnout are equally acceptable outcomes as long as engagement continues. This is why stepping away feels so threatening. It exposes how much of your motion was never chosen. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 is not about rebellion. Rebellion still reacts to the game. It still accepts its frame. This documentary is about something more destabilizing to systems of control, recognition. Because once you see the board, the urgency fades. Once you see the strings, the performance loses meaning. And once you realize the game was never designed for your fulfillment, only your function, participation becomes a choice again. This opening is not meant to alarm you. It is meant to orient you. Puppets are not foolish. They are uninformed. And in 2026, information, not force, is what separates agency from control. To understand why you must stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you need to see what quietly changed. Not socially, not politically, structurally. The methods of control did not become harsher, they became cleaner. In previous years, power still relied on authority figures, institutions, or visible hierarchies. There were managers, leaders, gatekeepers, people you could point to. Even when systems were unfair, they were legible. You could see where pressure was coming from. In 2026, that clarity is gone. Control has migrated away from people and into systems that appear neutral. This is the defining shift that turns ordinary individuals into puppets without resistance. In 2026, you are no longer managed, you are measured. You are no longer evaluated, you are ranked. You are no longer instructed, you are responded to. And response-based control is far more effective than command-based control. When a system responds instantly to your behavior through visibility, rewards, silence, or removal, you begin adjusting yourself preemptively. You anticipate consequences before they occur. You self-correct. You self-limit. This is how the strings disappear. The system doesn't pull you. You pull yourself into alignment. This is exactly why stopping being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 feels harder than in any previous era. There is no villain to confront, no rule to break, no authority to resist. The game is embedded in feedback loops that feel impersonal, automated, and therefore unquestionable. Another critical difference in 2026 is speed. Systems now move faster than human reflection. Decisions are expected immediately. Opinions are formed instantly. Relevance expires quickly. This creates a permanent state of reaction, and reaction is the natural environment of control. When you are constantly responding, you are never positioning. Being a puppet in 2026 doesn't mean someone tells you what to think. It means you are never given time to decide whether to think at all. This is why exhaustion has become such a powerful control mechanism. A tired mind seeks relief, not autonomy. It looks for shortcuts, templates, and defaults. And modern systems are more than happy to provide them, prepackaged identities, opinions, ambitions, and definitions of success. All you have to do is pick one. The choice feels personal. The outcome is predictable. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must recognize how optimization replaced ideology. You are no longer persuaded through belief. You are shaped through incentives. What performs well is repeated. What underperforms disappears. Over time, behavior converges, not because people agree, but because deviation is inefficient. This is why so many people feel interchangeable. Because in optimized systems, uniqueness is tolerated only if it produces value. Otherwise, it becomes friction, and friction is quietly removed. Another defining feature of 2026 is the collapse of long-term guarantees. Careers, reputations, relevance, none of these are secured by loyalty anymore. They are maintained by continuous alignment. This creates a subtle fear, not of punishment, but of replacement. When replacement is easy, compliance becomes instinctive. This fear does not announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as staying competitive, keeping up, or being realistic. But the effect is the same. You begin shaping your behavior around what is rewarded rather than what is intentional. That is the psychological pivot point where autonomy erodes. This is also why advice from the past increasingly fails. Older frameworks assumed slower systems, clearer hierarchies, and delayed consequences. In 2026, consequences are immediate and often silent. Visibility drops. Opportunities stop appearing. Communication cools. Nothing dramatic happens, yet direction changes completely. And because there is no explicit rejection, people blame themselves. This is a crucial part of the puppet mechanism. When outcomes are framed as personal performance issues rather than structural responses, individuals internalize failure. They adjust harder, try more, align further. The game tightens without ever revealing its rules. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires acknowledging that the game is no longer external. It operates through participation, metrics, and momentum. It does not demand belief. It demands engagement. And here is the uncomfortable insight. Most people are not trapped because they are oppressed. They are trapped because the game feels necessary. necessary for survival, relevance, belonging, or progress. Once necessity is accepted, autonomy becomes negotiable. This section is not about despair. It is about precision. You cannot step out of a game you misidentify. And if you believe 2026 is simply more of the same, you will keep using outdated mental models against a system that no longer plays by those rules. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must look inward before you look outward. Systems do not control everyone equally. They gravitate towards certain psychological profiles, not because those profiles are weak, but because they are predictable. The puppet mind is not defined by intelligence, education, or talent. In fact, highly capable people are often more vulnerable because they are deeply invested in performance, improvement, and approval. The modern game exploits those investments with surgical precision. The first defining trait of the puppet mind in 2026 is external validation dependency. When your sense of progress is confirmed primarily through feedback, metrics, reactions, acknowledgement, visibility, you become responsive to whatever provides that confirmation. Over time, behavior begins to orbit approval instead of intention. The system doesn't need to tell you what to do. It only needs to reward what it wants repeated. This is how someone becomes a puppet without coercion. They chase signals that were never designed to serve them. Another key trait is fear of exclusion over fear of manipulation. In 2026, belonging is conditional, access is fragile, and exclusion is rarely explicit. It appears as silence, invisibility, or being passed over. For many people, that threat feels more dangerous than being subtly steered. So they comply quietly, they adjust language, they suppress disagreement, they align publicly even when they doubt privately. Not because they are dishonest, but because isolation feels like failure. This fear creates one of the strongest strings in the modern game, self-censorship. Once people begin filtering themselves to remain acceptable, control has already succeeded. The puppet doesn't need direction. It needs only to avoid disapproval. A third psychological condition that keeps people trapped as puppets in 2026 is reactive identity formation. Instead of building identity from internal principles, many people now shape identity in response to external pressure. They become what is rewarded, visible, or trending. Their beliefs, goals, and even values evolve based on what performs well in the current environment. This creates a dangerous loop. The more adaptive someone becomes, the more useful they are to the system, and the less anchored they feel internally. Without a stable internal reference point, every shift in incentives feels like a personal crisis, and so adaptation accelerates. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must understand that adaptability without boundaries is not resilience. It is availability. Another often overlooked trait is over-identification with effort. Many people believe that working harder grants them control. In reality, excessive effort often increases exposure. The more visible, responsive, and invested you are, the easier you are to measure, and therefore to manage. The modern game rewards those who appear tireless, responsive, and aligned, but those same qualities reduce leverage. When you are always available, you are rarely in control of timing, and timing is power. The puppet mind also tends to confuse movement with agency. Busy people feel in control because they are constantly doing something, but motion is not the same as direction. In 2026, constant activity often prevents strategic stillness, the one state where the game becomes visible. This is why calm, detached individuals are harder to steer. They create gaps in the feedback loop. They delay response. They interrupt predictability. And unpredictability is the enemy of system-level control. Perhaps the most dangerous psychological trait, however, is moral overconfidence. The belief that, because my intentions are good, the system will treat me fairly. This assumption collapses quickly in 2026. Systems do not evaluate intention, they evaluate outcome. When people expect moral alignment from impersonal structures, they are consistently surprised and often hurt. That surprise keeps them emotionally reactive, which feeds right back into the game. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires abandoning the comforting belief that good faith protects you from exploitation. It doesn't. Only awareness does. This section is not meant to shame. These traits are human. They are encouraged, rewarded, and normalized. That is precisely why they are exploitable. Control does not target pathology. It targets common psychology. The defensive insight here is simple but unsettling. The more predictable your emotional responses, validation needs, and identity adjustments are, the easier it is for systems to guide you without force. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must understand a principle that feels unfair but is structurally true. Most games are decided before you ever make your first move. People imagine manipulation as something that happens during interaction through persuasion, pressure, or deception. In 2026, control happens earlier. It happens at the level of frameworks. The moment you accept the frame, you accept the outcome range. This is how modern systems maintain power without confrontation. They do not argue with you. They invite you in. Once inside, your choices feel real. You can move left or right, speed up or slow down. But what you cannot do is question why the board looks the way it does. The rules feel natural because everyone else accepts them. And that consensus is the strongest form of enforcement. This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by mistaking options for agency. Consider how often success is defined for you before you define it yourself. What progress should look like, what milestones matter, what counts as falling behind. These definitions are rarely neutral. They are optimized to serve the system that promotes them. And once internalized, they guide behavior automatically. The most effective games do not restrict behavior directly. They reward specific paths so heavily that alternatives feel irrational. When deviation is framed as inefficiency or irresponsibility, compliance feels like maturity. You are not forced to play. You are convinced it would be foolish not to. This is why questioning the game itself often provokes discomfort, not because the question is invalid, but because it destabilizes the shared illusion. People who step outside the frame threaten its legitimacy. And so they are labeled unrealistic, difficult, or disengaged. In 2026, the most powerful games are built on incentive gravity. They pull behavior toward predictable outcomes by making resistance costly, not through punishment, but through opportunity loss. You don't lose anything directly. You just stop being included. This subtle exclusion is what keeps most people aligned. It is quiet, deniable, and deeply effective. There is no moment of rebellion, just gradual narrowing. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must recognize that many struggles are not personal failures. They are design outcomes. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as intended. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes a familiar coping mechanism: self-blame. When people believe they are failing individually, they try harder. When they realize the game is structured to extract, not fulfill, the appropriate response changes. Another critical element of pre-won games is question substitution. Instead of asking, "Is this game worth playing?" people are encouraged to ask, "How can I win?" This keeps energy focused on optimization rather than evaluation. Effort increases, awareness decreases. In 2026, asking better questions is one of the few remaining forms of leverage. Notice how rarely people are invited to define their own metrics. Systems provide dashboards, rankings, scores, and comparisons. Once these are accepted, behavior follows automatically. You chase improvement on scales you did not design. That is the psychological handoff where autonomy is surrendered. This is also why many people feel strangely dissatisfied even when they succeed. They reach the destination, but it was never theirs. The game delivered exactly what it promised. The emptiness comes from realizing the promise was misaligned from the start. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 does not mean rejecting all systems. It means recognizing when a system's incentives are incompatible with your long-term autonomy. Some games can be played strategically. Others are designed to consume attention, energy, and identity. The defensive insight here is this: before improving your position inside a game, evaluate the game itself. Ask who benefits from the structure. Ask what behaviors are rewarded. Ask what kind of person consistently wins. If the winners are exhausted, replaceable, and perpetually anxious, the game is not neutral, and playing it harder will not set you free. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must understand that control no longer targets your beliefs. It targets your emotional timing. The fastest way to move someone without resistance is to keep them reacting. Reaction compresses time. It bypasses reflection. And in 2026, systems are optimized to provoke emotion not because emotion is chaotic, but because it is predictable. Fear, outrage, urgency, and validation hunger follow reliable patterns. When these states are activated, people behave consistently. That consistency is what allows large systems to steer millions of individuals without issuing a single command. This is why emotional reactivity has become the perfect control lever. In earlier eras, emotional manipulation required direct messaging, speeches, propaganda, persuasion. In 2026, emotional stimulation is ambient. It surrounds you. Notifications, signals, comparisons, and sudden shifts in visibility constantly reset your internal state. You are never fully settled, and an unsettled mind is easy to move. This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by living in a state of continuous emotional adjustment. When something provokes you, you respond. When something excites you, you chase it. When something threatens your relevance, you accelerate. Each response feels justified in isolation. But over time, the pattern forms, behavior driven by stimulus rather than strategy. The modern game does not need you to agree, it needs you to feel. Outrage is especially effective because it creates urgency without clarity. When people are angry, they act quickly. They align impulsively. They signal affiliation. This creates instant sorting: who reacts, how intensely, and in which direction. Systems learn who is movable. Fear operates differently. It narrows attention. It reduces risk tolerance. In 2026, fear is rarely explicit. It appears as anxiety about falling behind, being excluded, or becoming irrelevant. This low-grade fear keeps people compliant because stillness feels dangerous. Even positivity can be used as control. Validation spikes create dependency. When approval becomes intermittent, people chase it harder. Behavior becomes shaped around what produces recognition, not what produces stability. The puppet moves willingly, pulled by anticipation. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must recognize that emotional intensity is often inversely related to autonomy. The more intense your reaction, the less likely it was chosen. This does not mean suppressing emotion. Suppression creates its own form of control. The goal is delay. Emotional delay disrupts feedback loops. It introduces friction, and friction is what systems cannot optimize easily. Calm individuals are harder to steer because their responses are slower and less predictable. They do not amplify signals immediately. They do not reward provocation with attention. Over time, systems deprioritize them, not as punishment, but as efficiency. This is why composure has become a form of quiet resistance. Another critical insight is that emotional reactivity creates false urgency. Many actions in 2026 feel necessary, immediate, and unavoidable. Very few actually are. But when urgency is accepted, choice collapses into response. The puppet moves because stopping feels unsafe. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires reclaiming temporal control. Slowing down is not laziness, it is leverage. It allows you to see patterns instead of reacting to spikes. This is especially difficult because reactivity is socially rewarded. Fast responses signal engagement. Strong emotions signal authenticity. Detachment is often misread as indifference or weakness. But in reality, detachment restores optionality. The defensive insight here is precise. Any system that benefits from your emotional acceleration does not benefit from your autonomy. When you feel rushed, provoked, or compelled, pause. Not to resist, but to observe. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must question a belief that feels modern and empowering, but is deeply misleading. That visibility equals power. In earlier eras, visibility was a risk imposed from above. Surveillance was something done to people. In 2026, visibility is voluntary, incentivized, and framed as opportunity. And that shift makes it far more effective as a control mechanism. When you are constantly visible, you begin managing how you appear. When you manage how you appear, you preemptively adjust behavior. And when you adjust behavior before being asked, control has already succeeded. This is how visibility becomes a leash. Modern systems do not need to watch you closely. They need you to believe you are being observed. That belief alone is enough to shape conduct. You begin optimizing your actions not for internal coherence, but for external interpretation. What will this look like? How will it be received? Will it align? This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by confusing exposure with influence. Visibility creates self-surveillance. You monitor your own thoughts, words, and actions, filtering them for acceptability. Over time, this filtering becomes automatic. You don't need instruction. You need only to avoid deviation. What makes this especially powerful in 2026 is that visibility is tied to access. Being seen keeps you in circulation. Invisibility feels like erasure. So people perform alignment to remain visible, even when that alignment costs them clarity or integrity. This creates a paradox. The more visible you become, the less free you feel, because every action is now contextualized, compared, and interpreted. There is no private experimentation, no quiet recalibration. Everything becomes signal. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must recognize that constant signaling benefits the system more than the individual. When everything is public, nothing is strategic. You are always reacting to how you are perceived rather than deciding how you want to position yourself. Another overlooked effect of visibility is behavioral narrowing. When people know they are being observed, they take fewer risks. They stay within approved boundaries. They repeat what already works. Innovation declines. Conformity rises. This is why truly autonomous individuals often appear disengaged from constant exposure, not because they lack ambition, but because they understand that visibility trades optionality for attention. Visibility also accelerates comparison. When everyone is visible, everyone is ranked. This ranking is rarely explicit, but always felt. People begin measuring themselves against others using metrics they did not choose. This keeps attention outward and upward, never inward or strategic. In 2026, comparison is one of the most effective strings. It keeps people striving without questioning the direction of the climb. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires reevaluating what visibility is actually doing for you. Are you being seen, or are you being shaped? The defensive move is not total withdrawal. It is selective opacity, knowing when to be visible and when to be unreadable. Systems struggle with what they cannot easily measure. Ambiguity creates breathing room. Calm, low-signal individuals are harder to categorize, harder to rank, harder to steer. This does not make them powerful in the traditional sense, but it preserves autonomy. The key insight here is this: if visibility were inherently empowering, those with the most exposure would have the most control. In reality, they often have the least. They are locked into expectation, performance, and continuous response. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must confront a pressure that is rarely stated but constantly felt: the ease with which you can be replaced. In earlier systems, power relied on discipline. Mistakes were punished. Defiance was corrected. Authority was visible. In 2026, none of that is necessary. Replacement has become cheaper than correction and far more effective than punishment. When someone can be quietly swapped without explanation, behavior changes long before any threat is voiced. This is how the modern game maintains order without force. Replaceability works because it does not feel like oppression. There is no warning, no conflict, no confrontation. Opportunities simply stop arriving. Visibility fades. Attention shifts elsewhere. Nothing dramatic happens, and that ambiguity keeps people compliant. This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by adjusting behavior to avoid becoming disposable. The fear of replacement is especially powerful because it is structural, not personal. It doesn't matter how capable or committed you are. When systems are built around abundance, loyalty becomes optional. The system doesn't need to threaten you. It only needs alternatives. This creates a silent psychological contract. Stay aligned, stay useful, stay easy to integrate, or risk being bypassed. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that it trains preemptive obedience. People begin scanning for signals about what is acceptable. They adapt quickly. They reduce friction. They suppress dissent, all without being asked. Replacement removes the need for authority. There is no one to argue with. No decision to appeal. The system simply moves on. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must understand that replaceability is not a personal failure. It is a design feature. Systems optimize for continuity, not individual dignity. Once you accept this, the emotional sting fades, and strategic thinking becomes possible. Another overlooked aspect of replacement is how it fragments solidarity. When everyone feels individually replaceable, collective resistance weakens. People compete silently rather than coordinating openly. Each person tries to become indispensable alone, which paradoxically increases dependence on the system. This is why so many people overwork, overperform, and overexpose themselves. They believe visibility and effort reduce replaceability. In reality, they often increase it by making behavior legible and standardized. The system does not replace what it cannot easily replicate. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires reframing the goal. The goal is not to become irreplaceable. That is rarely possible. The goal is to become less substitutable in ways that are not easily measured. This means cultivating depth over display, position over performance, control over pace rather than volume. These qualities do not signal loudly, which is why systems struggle to evaluate them quickly. The defensive insight here is subtle but critical. When you feel pressure to constantly prove your value, you are already negotiating from a position of weakness. True leverage does not announce itself. It limits dependence. Replacement loses power when your identity, stability, and direction are not entirely tied to a single system. The puppet's strings tighten when there is only one stage to stand on. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must let go of a belief that feels stabilizing but is deeply deceptive. The belief that you are still in control simply because no one is forcing you. This belief is not naive. It is engineered. Modern systems no longer need to remove choice. They only need to constrain it. As long as options exist, people assume agency. As long as participation feels voluntary, control goes unquestioned. This is why the most effective games preserve the appearance of freedom while quietly shaping outcomes. In 2026, control does not announce itself. It reassures. You chose this. You're responsible for your outcome. You could always leave. These statements are technically true and strategically misleading. This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by mistaking constrained choice for autonomy. When people believe they are in control, they stop looking for leverage. They accept the frame. They optimize within boundaries they did not set. The system does not need to dominate, it only needs to be accepted as neutral. The illusion of control is powerful because it absorbs frustration. When outcomes disappoint, people look inward instead of outward. They work harder, improve skills, adjust behavior. Rarely do they question whether the game itself is aligned with their long-term autonomy. This self-correction loop is the system's greatest asset. Another reason the illusion persists is that control is now fragmented. You have control over small decisions, timing, presentation, surface-level choices. This keeps you engaged, but control over direction, structure, and consequence remains centralized. It feels like steering until you realize the road only goes one way. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must distinguish between operational control and strategic control. Being able to act does not mean being able to choose the context in which action matters. Most people have the former. Very few have the latter. This is why freedom feels increasingly hollow. You can choose how hard to run, but not where the race leads. You can choose your expression, but not how it is evaluated. You can choose participation, but not the terms. And because no one is forcing you, resistance feels unreasonable. Complaining feels ungrateful. Stepping back feels risky. The illusion protects itself by making dissent appear irrational. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 requires a shift in awareness, not rebellion. The goal is not to reject all structure, but to recognize when control has been reduced to motion without direction. The moment you stop equating activity with autonomy, the illusion weakens. This section also reveals why advice focused on taking control of your life often fails. It assumes control is an internal trait. In reality, control is contextual. It depends on leverage, optionality, and independence from single systems. You cannot think your way out of a structurally constrained environment. You can only reposition. The defensive insight here is this: any environment that constantly reassures you of your freedom while narrowing your options is not designed for your autonomy. True control does not need to remind you that you have it. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, recognition must come before resistance. Once you are reacting emotionally, optimizing behavior, or chasing re-entry, the game is already working. Defense begins earlier, at the level of perception. The first signal you are being played is compressed time. When everything feels urgent, immediate, or time-sensitive, autonomy is shrinking. Systems that benefit from your compliance rarely give you time to think. They accelerate decisions, so reflection feels like risk. If you notice that slowing down feels dangerous, that is not intuition, it is conditioning. This is exactly how someone becomes a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, by mistaking urgency for importance. Ask yourself a simple question: who benefits if I act right now? If the answer is unclear, delay is your first line of defense. The second signal is emotional spike without clarity. Strong emotion paired with vague reasoning is a classic control pattern. You feel compelled, threatened, or excited, but cannot clearly articulate why. When emotion leads and explanation follows, behavior becomes predictable. Systems learn what provokes you and repeat it. In 2026, being emotionally fluent but strategically numb is a liability. Another warning sign is reward inconsistency. When approval, visibility, or opportunity appears unpredictably, people chase it harder. This intermittent reinforcement creates dependency. You begin adjusting behavior in hopes of re-triggering the reward. Over time, this replaces intention with anticipation. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, notice when you are optimizing for signals you do not control. A fourth signal is narrowing acceptable behavior. If you find yourself gradually editing opinions, language, or actions, not because you changed your mind, but because deviation feels costly, control is already active, especially when no one explicitly told you to change. This is how compliance becomes internalized. Another key indicator is self-blame replacing structural awareness. When outcomes worsen and your first instinct is "I need to try harder," rather than "something about this setup isn't working," the system has successfully redirected attention inward. Self-improvement becomes a distraction from system evaluation. Improvement is valuable, but not when it prevents diagnosis. Pay attention also to comparison pressure. When your motivation increasingly comes from seeing others advance, outperform, or gain approval, your behavior is being externally paced. Comparison accelerates conformity. It keeps you chasing relative position rather than absolute stability. In 2026, comparison is one of the quietest strings. Another subtle sign is loss of optionality. If stepping back, saying no, or disengaging feels disproportionately risky, dependence has formed. Healthy systems tolerate pause. Manipulative systems punish stillness, not overtly, but through disappearance. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, monitor how much space you are allowed to take without consequence. The final recognition signal is identity erosion. When your sense of self becomes tightly bound to performance, relevance, or alignment, control becomes personal. Any threat to the system feels like a threat to you. At that point, defense feels like self-sabotage. This is the deepest string and the hardest to see. The defensive insight of this section is precise. Control becomes visible not through commands, but through constraints on time, emotion, and exit. When these narrow simultaneously, you are not navigating, you are being positioned. Recognition does not require confrontation, it requires observation. The moment you see the pattern, urgency loses power. And when urgency fades, choice returns. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, the final step is not confrontation. It is repositioning. Most people imagine autonomy as defiance, refusal, exposure, rebellion. But rebellion still accepts the game's frame. It still reacts to its pressure. In 2026, the most effective form of autonomy is quieter and far less dramatic. Non-participation where it matters most. Stepping out of the game does not mean disappearing from society. It means disengaging from the incentives that move you automatically. The first shift is from reaction to position. Throughout this documentary, we've seen how urgency, emotion, visibility, and replacement keep people moving. Stepping out begins when you stop responding immediately. You allow space between stimulus and action. That space is not emptiness, it is leverage. When you slow your responses, systems receive less data. Less data means less predictability, and unpredictability weakens control. This is exactly how someone stops being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, not by fighting the strings, but by becoming harder to pull. The second shift is from validation to stability. Games reward attention, recognition, and constant proof of value. Stepping out means prioritizing forms of security that do not depend on continuous approval. When your stability is not entirely tied to one system, pressure loses its edge. This does not mean disengaging from effort. It means choosing effort that compounds privately rather than performs publicly. Another critical shift is from visibility to selectivity. You do not need to be invisible, but you do need to be intentional. When everything is shared, nothing is strategic. Retaining opacity where possible preserves optionality. It allows you to recalibrate without consequence. Systems cannot easily manipulate what they cannot clearly see. To stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026, you must also redefine success. Success in most games is measured by progression inside the system, but autonomy often looks like lateral movement or even stillness. Progress that costs identity is not progress. Opportunity that removes choice is not opportunity. Stepping out also requires psychological uncoupling. You must separate your worth from performance metrics you did not design. When feedback stops defining identity, emotional hooks lose their grip. You can observe outcomes without internal collapse. This is not detachment from life. It is detachment from manipulation. The final and most important insight is this: puppets are not weak, they are unaware. The moment awareness stabilizes, the strings lose tension. Systems rely on speed, emotion, and assumption. Awareness disrupts all three. You do not need to announce your exit. You do not need to expose the game. You do not need to convince others. Quiet exits are the hardest to counter because they deny the system engagement. In 2026, autonomy will not belong to the loudest, the fastest, or the most visible. It will belong to those who control their pace, protect their attention, and choose their games carefully. Stop being a puppet in someone else's game in 2026 is not a call to isolation. It is a call to intentional participation. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to choose differently, even when no one else does. And once you realize that, the game changes, not because the system does, but because you do.